Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. There are politics ahead, but we're going to start with war fighting tonight. Tom, Joscelyn, and Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, are here. They keep the Long War Journal. There's a story up at the Wall Street Journal now. The CIA is claiming that the Russians are deliberately targeting the Free Syrian Army that has been developed by the CIA over this last year, 2 years of resistance against the Assad regime. I underline the surprise here is that the CIA is acknowledging that it has ops on the ground. That's a detail that's not obvious in this complaint. Heretofore, my understanding is that the CIA has been denying it has ops on the ground. The U.S. military is also trying or attempting to develop its ops on the ground, Free Syrian Army. However, the targeting of the anti-Assad forces in Syria is part of the story, and Tom Roggio will take us there when we travel to the al-Nusra front in western Syria. But we're going to start in Afghanistan. Over these last 72 hours, a tragedy in Afghanistan. A hospital, Doctors Without Borders, in Kunduz, was targeted by the American strike force of a C-130 gunship. This is a great big monster of a weapon that you use generally in conjoined with special forces. There is a changing story about how this targeting came about. The Doctors Without Borders is asserting that the Americans had their coordinates. They knew the GPS. And so when this was called in, how was it missed? There's also reporting that there was fighting around the hospital. That's now denied. There was also reporting that the Afghan forces targeted. That is now qualified by saying the American Special Forces might have been working with the Afghan forces. In other words, it's more than fog of war. There's a complete confusion of how this happened. It's a tragedy. It will be played out over many days because Doctors Without Borders is saying this is a war crime. They want an international investigation going forward. We'll see. We're going to start, however, in Afghanistan generally, big picture, because Bill Roggio has done us all the favor of putting a map of Afghanistan up at Long War Journal and identifying the districts, the parts of Afghanistan that are now in Taliban control. Bill, a very good evening to you. What I see on your map is that if this was a game of Chinese Go, the Taliban is surrounding major population centers. Let's start in the northeast, around Kunduz. What does the pattern tell you here about its strengths for the Taliban? Good evening, Bill.
Good evening, John, and thank you. Yes, and first and foremost, I want to be clear. This map, this is what we could tell from the open source. We believe that there's a large numbers of districts that are either Taliban contested or Taliban outright controlled by the Taliban. But a lot of the reporting from Afghanistan is beginning to go dark. So this map's put together based on either press reports or Taliban claims, which have been accurate in the past. So again, it's a best effort based on the information we have. I would argue there's far more districts. You could double. We have, I believe, 63 contested or controlled. You could probably reasonably double that, particularly in the east and in Kandahar province. But what this map up in the north tells us is the Taliban has made a major push and has devoted a lot of resources to taking over, particularly the provincial capital of Kunduz, and it's seeking to establish control of the borders with Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. It's very clear, the Taliban. So, and to me, this is a major failure of by the way, of the U.S. surge. The U.S. devoted nearly all of its resources during the surge to Helmand and Kandahar in the south, and the Taliban devoted a lot of said, fine, we'll fight a rearguard action there, and we'll fight elsewhere. And I think you're seeing a direct result of that. They've made a lot of inroads up in the north. They took control of the provincial capital, which is a major propaganda coup. It's still contested to this day. Afghan officials are claiming they control most, if not all, of the city, but their claims have rung hollow. I think the Taliban really want to establish themselves up in the north and put a real dent in what should be a traditional base of power for the warlords.
Right. This is not the Pashtun part of Afghanistan. This is where Tajiks dominate. Other ethnicities dominate in the north, and the Taliban are establishing a fortress up here. But where are they being resupplied, Bill? From Pakistan or from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan?
I think it's probably a combination of both, but you could always count on our friends, the Pakistanis, to be supplying the Taliban. If you look in, these are tough supply routes. This is real Hindu Kush up here, very, very mountainous areas, tough to get supplies in, up in Badashan province, up through into Kunduz and the area around that. But I have no doubt that they're making it happen. But they're, look, the Afghan government isn't even all that secure in the major supply lines going through Jalalabad. The Taliban have no lack of weapons. And also, by the way, what you see happening going in the north, it really puts to bed the idea that this is just a Pashtun insurgency. The Taliban have groups like the Islamic Jihad Union, and which has Tajiks and Uzbeks and Uyghurs, and a whole host of nationalities are fighting with the Taliban. It's not just Pashtun, even though that traditionally the minorities in Afghanistan have opposed the Taliban. It doesn't mean all of them. The Taliban have won enough to be able to wage an effective insurgency and take over a major city.
All right, we'll come back to Afghanistan in a moment. This is a vast battlefield, as we've talked about for more than 2 years now, and we need to go to Syria. This is the Al-Nusra Front. Tom, a very good evening to you. You have an item at Long War Journal about the Al-Nusra Front sending photos of Russian airstrikes. Where are these airstrikes, and can we tell, sending out these photographs, what al-Nusra is trying to communicate to us? That they're under attack? Are they recruiting? Are they saying we're retreating? Good evening to you, Tom.
Good evening, John. Well, mainly the jihadis have been pretty quiet about exactly what's being hit by the Russians, and this may be because they don't want to actually give away the details of what the Russians are doing. The Russians are hitting, right now they're hitting multiple targets. Very few of the airstrikes are actually targeting the Islamic State or ISIS. Many of the airstrikes are actually targeting other rebel groups, including Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda's official branch in Syria, and some of its closest allies. But they're also targeting some CIA-backed groups, which are coming to light now, that are actually in Syria. And you mentioned earlier that there's this Wall Street Journal report that's out this evening, which I think is fairly remarkable because it's actually naming some of the groups that are receiving CIA assistance. Now, what's interesting about this is none of the groups that are being mentioned have really done a lot of damage to the Assad regime as far as we can tell of late. Basically, most of the damage that's been done to the Assad regime has come from the Jaish al-Fatah coalition, which is led by the Nusra Front and its closest jihadist allies, including another group called the Roggio al-Sham. And the Russians are certainly going after them. But what this report from the Wall Street Journal shows is that, in fact, there are these CIA-backed groups that receive training, weapons, and other things from the CIA that are also being hit by the Russians. And the Wall Street Journal is citing U.S. officials who are saying that basically the Russians have been deliberately targeting these groups. So it isn't that they're just sort of hitting them by happenstance in the middle of a broader campaign. What they find is that the sequencing of the targeting by the Russians suggests that they've actually got intelligence and are deliberately targeting CIA-backed rebels in Syria. Now, this is very, very interesting. And of course, there's no evidence at this point that the U.S. is going to come to their aid or do anything to help them. So this is even more of a mess.
I want to go over this, Tom, carefully, because my understanding is that this is the first time we have confirmation from Washington, from the CIA, that they have CIA ops on the ground. I've not seen this confirmed before. In fact, I think I've seen it denied.
Well, the thing about this is we knew last year the CIA clearly had a footprint with some of these groups because what started happening is there's a group called Harakat Hazim which showed up with very sophisticated and expensive U.S.-made anti-tank tow missiles. And what happened was the Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda, saw that they were getting these missiles and decided, well, hey, we'd like them for ourselves. And so they overran Harakat Hazim pretty quickly and took their weaponry and then used the weaponry in the siege in Idlib province where Nusra Front and its allies took over earlier this year. And so there have been indications like that where you can see clear American influence, clear CIA influence on the ground in Syria because obviously they're getting the American-made weapons from somebody, and obviously at some point in the production chain or supply chain is the CIA. But what's interesting about this, to your point, John, is that the details in the Wall Street Journal report are naming additional groups which I had not previously seen as being publicly identified as receiving CIA backing. And they're even naming some of the commanders in the report who were saying that their guys received some CIA training. So these are definitely new details.
And Tom, did you see that suggestion in the paragraph near the bottom? The White House has succeeded at keeping man pads out of Syria since the start of the war because of concerns they could fall into the wrong hands and be used against commercial aircraft in the region and beyond. Shall I read this as a roundabout way of saying man pads are going back into Syria because of the effectiveness of the Russian airstrikes?
Well, I don't think they're going to send man-pads back in. I mean, I think the lesson from Harakat Azim and other groups that have been backed by the CIA is if you send, I think if you read the quotes there toward the end of that piece, what they're saying is basically they're asking for these weapons to be sent into areas where Al-Qaeda is operating, and we're not going to do that because the problem is they already sent in these anti-tank tow missiles, and lo and behold, what happens is yes, some of them were maintained in the possession of these so-called Free Syrian Army brigades, but we saw a good number of them end up in Al-Qaeda's hands very quickly, and then Al-Qaeda used them to basically, in their assault on Idlib earlier this year, to consolidate their control of territory in northwestern Syria. So the whole point here is you can't introduce these things into Syria when it's obvious that they could easily fall into Al-Qaeda's hands.
Man-pads, forgive me, man-pads stand for Man-Portable Air Defense Systems. This is the shoulder-fired or team-fired weapon, very effective against aircraft attacking you. For example, Sukhoi 25s or Sukhoi 30s or Russian Mi-28 attack helicopter. Tom Joscelyn, Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. When we come back, we're going back to Afghanistan, which is trembling for the Taliban attacks. I'm John Batchelor.